Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thewlis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
I'm very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Good morning. We begin business today with general questions. The first question from Daniel Johnson.
I asked the Scottish Government how many remand and how many sentenced prisoners have been sent to HMYOI Polmont since 2013 due to space being unavailable at secure care units.
Cabinet Secretary Hamza Yousaf.
In relation to solemn proceedings, in relation to solemn proceedings, there have been none. Local authorities, of course, are responsible for remand and summary proceedings, and the Scottish Government doesn't hold information on those particular cases.
Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, but given that we are now a month on from the tragic circumstances of William Lindsay's death, I do find it surprising that the Scottish Government does not know the number in question, because I think it is vital that we understand this so that we can put right what tragically went wrong. So can I ask what the government is going to do to find out what the figure is, and then what ultimately will do to put right the circumstances that surrounded that death, because ultimately I think that is what is required.
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I say a couple of things? In relation to his first question, my answer was that we don't hold that information on record because it is local authorities' responsibility. It is something, of course, I could approach local authorities to ask them about. But what I would say is we have to be really careful when talking about any incident. If I take the case that the member referenced in terms of William Lindsay's own case, it would be incorrect, it would not be factual to say that there wasn't secure unit space available at the time of William Lindsay's case on the 3rd and the 4th of October. My understanding, the information that I have, is that there was secure unit availability. Now, that would have been for the local authority and the social work department in particular, but the local authority to, of course, have found that out and to present that to the court at the time. In terms of what we're doing, the Deputy First Minister and I are working extremely closely because there is an issue around secure unit availability, the fact that if that is not up to a certain level of capacity, then those secure units could potentially close, and none of us would want that. So we are working on options. In fact, I've seen options presented to me and to the Deputy First Minister just this week, and of course I will keep the member and others updated to when we get to what I would think is a more satisfactory position in this regard.
Annie Wells.
It's estimated that 70% of those in prison have a mental health problem. In a report by the Health and Sport Committee last year on healthcare in prisons, it was noted that there is a considerable variation across prisons in relation to mental health care available. What action is being taken by the Scottish Government to ensure that prisoners, no matter where they have been sentenced, are able to access mental health support that best fits their needs?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Annie Wells for asking that question? It's hugely important. I've visited prisons across the prison estate. I'll continue to visit more prisons in the prison estate, and mental health and the addressing of mental health is absolutely the core of what is provided, but I don't doubt at all that we can go further and that more can be done. And this is in a variety of settings. We know that, for example, when it comes to female offenders, that mental health issues present themselves even more than they do in amongst the male population. But in amongst the male population, there are mental health issues. We have, of course, when it comes to young people, the Talk to Me strategy also. She'll know from my answer that I gave previously, looking at the issues in at Polmont, we have instructed a review of mental health services in amongst Polmont because, again, we're not satisfied that we are at the best place possible. So we'll continue to work with SPS, with the NHS, of course, who provide services, but where we can learn best practice elsewhere, then this government absolutely is open-minded to make sure that we're tackling mental health issues, whether they're in the prison estate or indeed out with.
Question number 2, Miles Briggs.
Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what its position is on a feasibility study being carried out to address congestion on the Edinburgh City bypass.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
The Scottish Government recognises the important role that the A720 plays for Edinburgh and its region and the national economy. Transport Scotland is currently monitoring the queuing on this particular route and investigating how this can be better managed. Additionally, Transport Scotland is undertaking a second strategic transport project review. This will be a multimodal review and will consider the performance of the A720. We have committed to taking this forward in a collaborative fashion, which will provide a robust evidence base to support future decisions on investment in strategic transport infrastructure across Scotland for the next 20 years.
Miles Briggs.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. It's clear that we need to see work commence now to take forward a long-term solution and to address the constant gridlock on the A720. Can I therefore ask the Minister if he'd be willing for the Scottish Government also to commit to a feasibility study, and will he agree to meet with representatives from across the area, as I know this is a growing problem for all of us across this Parliament?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the presiding officer, the member may be interested to know that the Strategic Transport Projects Review will consider the entirety of the A720, and that work will start next year, which will be informed by the National Transport Strategy, which is due to be published at the end of next year. The STPR2 will allow us to set out what the strategic investment decisions will be for our transport infrastructure over the course of the next 20 years, including making that assessment of the A720. So the very process that the member is making reference to is facilitated through the STPR process, and I would encourage those who have an interest in that matter to engage in that process once it's been undertaken by Transport Scotland.
Question number 3, Bruce Crawford.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how many businesses in the Stirling constituency have been lifted out of paying non-domestic rates under the Small Business Bonus Scheme.
Minister Kate Forbes.
Information on the Small Business Bonus Scheme is not currently available by parliamentary constituency, but as at 1st of June 2018, 2,670 business properties in the Stirling local authority area were lifted out of paying rates through the Small Business Bonus Scheme. Since the Small Business Bonus Scheme was introduced by this government, it has saved premises in Stirling nearly £39 million.
Bruce Crawford.
Well, that's very good information from the Minister. I wonder, in addition, can you tell us how much small businesses in my constituency will save next year as a result of the SNP government's budget that delivers the best budget package for small businesses anywhere in the UK. A budget that, incredibly, the Tories have already said, including Dean Lockhart, who sees here today, they will vote against.
Minister.
Well, I share the member's incredulity that the Tories might be considering to vote against something that saves businesses so much in hard cash. And spend on the small business bonus scheme was £5.8 million in 2018-19 in the Stirling local authority area. And since the scheme was introduced by the government, it has saved premises a whopping £38.9 million in this area.
Dean Lockhart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scottish Government's figures released 2 weeks ago show that more than 1,200 businesses, large and small, across the Stirling area have waited over 18 months for the outcome of their appeals against punishing rate increases. For many, the outcome of their appeal will be the difference between staying in business or being forced to close and lay off staff. If, like me, the Minister finds this situation unacceptable, what measures will she take to address it?
Minister.
Well, I thank the member for that question. And on 2 points. On the first, in terms of appeals, one of the recommendations in the Barclay Review, which we have accepted in full and which I'm taking forward as part of primary legislation next year, as well as other guidance support, is to make sure that the appeals process works for businesses and make sure that it puts justice at the heart of businesses, and businesses that need access to justice can get it. But what Dean Lockhart doesn't acknowledge either is that in the Stirling area, not only are more businesses in receipt of something like the small business bonus scheme, but the overall value that is ensuring that businesses save as part of the small business bonus scheme is directly contributing to business growth in that area.
Question number 4, Gordon Lindhurst.
To ask the Scottish Government what progress it is making with developing a peer-to-peer mentorship scheme to boost exports alongside CBI Scotland.
Minister Ivan McKee.
The Minister launched the Export Challenge on 26th November this year, an event attended by around 100 businesses from across Scotland who have shown support and interest in the challenge. Good progress has been made in developing the detail of the programme, and we're working closely with partners including CBI Scotland and Scottish Development International to ensure its successful implementation. And I would like to take this opportunity to encourage businesses who feel that they would benefit from being mentored or who are experienced exporters and would like to participate as a mentor to volunteer for consideration to take part in the programme.
Gordon Lindhurst.
In a recent policy paper, CBI Scotland outlined a number of measures the Scottish Government can take to support Scottish businesses to export. Some of these recommendations include addressing the falling number of students passing foreign language exams, making up the shortfall in STEM subject uptake, and looking at whether secondary, further or higher education could offer opportunities to study commercial international trade. Does the Minister agree that improving our children's education in these areas is key to growing exports? And has he discussed these matters specifically with the Education Secretary?
Ivan McKee.
I can understand the point that the member is making, and I'll undertake to have a conversation and take those matters up with my colleagues, the Education Minister, to discuss that. Clearly, that's one aspect, and that's part of the overall approach that we need to be looking at.
Question number 5, Monica Lennon.
To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on the procedures used by the Public Defence Solicitor's Office and the Scottish Legal Aid Board to investigate workplace bullying and harassment.
Minister Ash Denham.
The Scottish Government has a zero tolerance to any form of bullying, harassment and discrimination from any source, and where it occurs, it's essential that it gets reported and tackled. It's for the Scottish Government, in overseeing the work of public bodies, to promote diversity and help create an open culture which will increase the likelihood of individuals speaking up about any wrongdoing. As the Scottish Legal Aid Board is a non-departmental public body, staff are employed directly by the organisation. All public bodies must have their own robust grievance policies and procedures in place, and the Scottish Government requires these grievance policies and procedures to comply with appropriate employment legislation, that they are accessible, that they are clearly understood by staff, and importantly, that staff know how to access and use them. The Scottish Government also provides a model code of conduct for staff of public bodies, and SLAB have confirmed that it complies with this model.
Monica Lennon.
I thank the Minister for her reply. Kerry Evans is a lawyer in the Public Defence Solicitor's Office. Kerry is deeply unhappy with the way SLAB have handled her claims of bullying by her line manager. As reported in the Sunday Mail, the Scottish Legal Aid Board gave Kerry's personal diary about alleged incidents in her workplace to her line manager without her knowledge. The Information Commissioner has said this was a breach of data protection obligations. I understand other concerns about bullying at this public agency have been raised. Will the Minister take this seriously and request an independent investigation of this case and make sure that staff have full confidence in the policies and procedures that are in place?
Minister.
Let me assure the Chamber that while Scottish Ministers have no mechanism to intervene or to comment on any individual or current cases, the Scottish Government is working to tackle and to challenge the underlying attitudes and inequalities that perpetuate this kind of behaviour, and I'm sure that the member would accept that. But on the particular case, the Chief Executive has confirmed that an independent and external organisation with expertise in employment law, HR and health and safety matters was commissioned specifically to review the circumstances and the organisation's policies and procedures for handling such matters. The Chief Executive has confirmed that relevant policies and procedures will be reviewed and updated in light of the recommendations from the external review, and I expect to be kept updated on any developments by the Chair of the Board. The right to privacy is very important, and public bodies are responsible for ensuring that they adhere to data protection laws, and the Information Commissioner's Office is responsible for that regulation. The Scottish Government, I'm sure the member will understand, cannot comment on this particular case, which relates to an ongoing grievance.
Thank you. Question 6 has not been lodged. Question 7, Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions it has had with the United Nations regarding proposals to raise the internationally advised minimum age of criminal responsibility to 14.
Minister Marie Todd.
The UNCRC is consulting on its draft revised General Comment No. 10 to seek views on its proposal to advise a minimum age of criminal responsibility of 14. No final decision has been made, and we will, of course, consider the views of the UN Committee once a final version of the revised General Comment has been received. To date, we have had no discussions with the UN Committee. We were contacted by the UK Government on 11th of December 2018 regarding the response to this consultation, and we will provide our contribution in due course.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I'm grateful to the Minister for that answer. Fewer than 700 12 and 13-year-olds are referred to the Children's Reporter on offence grounds each year. A further half dozen are referred to criminal courts. These are not significant numbers, but the impact of a criminal record on life chances for any young person is significant, it is traumatic, and it is lifelong. It's why the Children's Reporters Administration told the Human Rights Committee at stage 1 of the Age of Criminal Responsibility Bill that there was an imperative to go further than 12 in setting out our new ACR. So can I ask the Minister, given that the UN will likely raise the internationally prescribed minimum age of criminal responsibility to 14 in February, does she share my concern that the bill will be out of date before its ink is even dry?
Minister.
The Scottish Government absolutely recognises and respects the significance of the UN Committee's general comments as an aid to interpreting the Convention. We are committed to respecting and protecting human rights. We consider the recommendations by international organisations very closely in our policy making, and we seek to uphold the very highest standards of children's rights in a responsible and in an appropriate way. In Scotland's case, the age of criminal responsibility has to be looked at within the context of our unique children's hearing system. The children's hearing system provides a distinct welfare-led alternative to criminal procedure for the vast majority of children under 16. Raising the age of criminal responsibility must be looked at in the wider context of current approaches. And we should all acknowledge the government's willingness, the government's record in this area and its willingness to bring forward further reform in Scotland.
Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. While we believe that 12 strikes the right balance, can the Minister confirm if she was aware that the UN were considering raising their recommended age of criminal responsibility before she introduced the bill and gave evidence to the committee at stage 1?
Minister.
The Scottish Government was made aware of the consultation on the 14th of November 2018, the day after the Scottish Parliament's Stage 1 debate on the age of criminal responsibility.
Thank you. Question 8, Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what the clear-up rate for housebreakings is.
Minister Cabinet Secretary Hamza Youssef.
Clear-up rate for housebreaking was 23.9% in 17-18. That was up from 22.5% in the previous year. This has remained at similar levels over the last decade. Since the advent of devolution, the number of housebreakings recorded by the police fell by 73% to their lowest level since comparable records began.
Liam Kerr.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, which, phrased a little more bluntly, confirms that over 3/4 of housebreakings in Scotland go unsolved and unpunished under the SNP. This is a disgrace. When did the Cabinet Secretary last meet the Chief Constable specifically to discuss this issue?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Chief Constable and I obviously meet on a regular occasion and discuss how we can improve safety and of course, when it comes to issues of housebreaking, again, that is something that I talk about regularly with my officials and with the police. But I would say, on a serious point, of course, when it comes to clear-up rates, we want to work to ensure that they are better, they are higher. But I would say the members should not ignore the fact that housebreakings have dramatically fallen with the SNP in power. In fact, in the North East region, the one that the member has an interest in, I'm sure they've fallen by 58% between 2008 and 9 and 2017 and 18. And the clear-up for housebreaking in the North East has increased by 5% in the last year. So we are starting to improve. I agree with him that they should be higher, and we will continue to work with the police to do that. But I'm sure he would welcome the fall in housebreaking over the last decade.
Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Minister tell us how clear-up figures for housebreaking in Scotland compare to England with the Tories in government? I understand that there it's less than 10%.
Cabinet Secretary Hamza Youssef.
Well, what I would say is, of course, there are many comparisons to make with England and Wales. We have seen a reduction, of course, of housebreakings, and in fact, in England and Wales, there has been an increase in housebreaking. Now, that might be in part because in Scotland we have invested in our police officers and our police service. We have, for example, in Scotland, awarded a 6.5% pay increase, while in England and Wales, the police service are taking the UK government to court because they won't pay them the appropriate amount. And of course, in Scotland, since the SNP has been in power, we've increased police numbers to record levels, to 913 more than we inherited. And in England and Wales, they've fallen by almost 20,000. A terrible indictment, of course, of the UK Tory government. So, therefore, of course, that is why we are seeing housebreakings reduced in Scotland, whereas we are seeing them increase in England and Wales. So we'll continue to invest in our police officers, continue to make sure Scotland is kept safe, and we'll leave the Conservatives to cart from a sedentary position. All right,
Thank you. That concludes general questions. We turn to First Minister's questions. Question number 1 from Jackson Carlo.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yesterday, Derek Mackay once again complained about the UK Government's block grant for Scotland next year. Other than our Finance Secretary, who else in Scotland is claiming that the money he receives from Westminster will go down next year?
First Minister.
Well, in my experience, people the length and breadth of Scotland are complaining about Tory austerity and Tory cuts to the budget of this government. The money, of course, that Jackson Carlo claims is extra in the Scottish budget. Firstly, most of that is for the NHS, which we more than pass on to the NHS. The rest, and perhaps Jackson Carlo wants to listen to this, but most of the rest comes from a capital uplift relating to changes in how Network Rail is funded. It doesn't translate into any additional investment whatsoever. The facts, as Derek Mackay set out in Parliament yesterday, are these. Money available to us for everything other than health is down by £340 million. That's 1.3% in real terms just in this year. And over the decade, Tory austerity has taken £2 billion out of this government's budget. That is 7% in real terms. And when you consider that, I think the fact that Derek Mackay yesterday managed a £750 million increase for the National Health Service, real terms protection for local government, real terms protection for the education portfolio, more spending on the limited areas of welfare that we are responsible for than we inherited from the UK Government. I think Derek Mackay has done a very, very good job indeed.
Jackson Carlaw.
Well, once again, nice excerpts from our big book of Voldemort's excuses, but not actually an answer to the question I put, because the Fraser of Allender Institute says the block grant is going up. The Scottish Fiscal Commission says it's going up. The Scottish Parliament's Information Service says it's going up. It's just a pity that typically the First Minister refuses to acknowledge that. Even her own budget document shows that it's going up by over £500 million. So let's give her another chance. Let's give her another chance. In a further boast yesterday, Mr Mackay claimed that 99% of Scotland's taxpayers will pay less tax next year than this. Can the First Minister tell us who is mostly responsible for this welcome tax cut? Is it Derek Mackay or is it Philip Hammond?
First Minister.
I'm sorry to disappoint Jackson Carlaw. I didn't even have to get to page 1 of my big book because his questions weren't that testing for me. And even now, I'm not going to have to open. The fact of the matter is, it's not just the fact that, yes, 99% of taxpayers in Scotland will pay less tax next year than they do this year. Due to the decisions of Derek Mackay, 55% of taxpayers in Scotland will pay less tax than their counterparts in the rest of the UK, making Scotland, of course, the fairest tax part of the UK. And, of course, what is really irritating Jackson Carlaw today is that we have chosen not to give a tax cut to higher rate taxpayers like him. We have an increased tax for higher rate taxpayers. We've just chosen not to reduce it. Now, I know Jackson Carlaw wants us to match the tax cut for higher rate taxpayers in the rest of the UK. So I'll give him this invitation again, which he didn't take up last week. Maybe he will do so now. If we were to do that, it would cost £500 million, £500 million. Now, when he replied to Derek Mackay yesterday, Murdo Fraser, I can immediately see Murdo Fraser probably hiding up the back. Not only did he call for us to spend an extra £500 million cutting tax for higher rate taxpayers, he also seemed to call for us to spend an extra £1 billion on local government. So can Jackson Carlaw just explain to me right now, where in the budget does he want us to take the money? Is it from health? Is it from education? Is it from local government? I am waiting with bated breath for the answer to that question.
Jackson Carlaw.
I'm actually here to ask questions, but what I will do is... Let's turn to it, because in the Scotland's Economic and Fiscal Forecast, December 2018, it says, we expect Derek Mackay's decisions yesterday to start to have an effect on tax residency decisions in Scotland. You can't tax people who aren't coming to Scotland to tax, First Minister, if you start to ensure that residency decisions are taken by those people we need in our hospitals to fill consultancy vacancies. If you start to take decisions that affect the number of employers we have, then you won't have higher tax rate payers here that you can continue to tax the way that you currently do. But let's return. I asked 2 questions and I failed to get 2 answers, because the answer, of course, was that it's Mr Hammond who has reduced taxation. According to the Scottish Government's own figures, from April next year, a household with an income of £15,000 a year will get a tax cut of £130.49. £130 of that much-deserved tax break is because of the decision by the UK Government to increase the tax-free personal allowance. So how much of that tax break will be down to the Scottish Government's budget announced yesterday? All of 49 pence. That's the real difference between these benches. A £130 tax cut for low-paid workers delivered by the Conservatives, while the SNP give them the price of a packet of crisps. So let me give the First Minister one last chance to see if she can be straight with people today. Again yesterday, Mr Mackay, again yesterday, Mr Mackay boasted that in 2018 the economy was predicted to grow in Scotland at a faster rate than the UK as a whole. So, First Minister, great news if it's true. However, according to the Scottish Fiscal Commission, in how many of the following years is this also predicted to be the case?
First Minister.
Is already growing faster this year than the economy in the rest of the UK, and that wasn't predicted a year or so ago, so I'm not entirely sure that Jackson Carlaw's question in that regard takes them very far. But let me return to some of his other questions. He talks a lot about the personal allowance. Can I gently remind Jackson Carlaw the personal allowance is reserved to the UK government, and they oppose the devolution of that. He also talks about behavioural impacts. If he read the Scottish Fiscal Commission reports a bit more closely, he would see that the numbers fully take account of any predicted behavioural impact. And even taking account of that, Derek Mackay's decision to freeze the higher rate threshold rather than increase it with inflation raises £68 million in the next financial year. So if Jackson Carlaw doesn't want us to do that, he has to tell us where that £68 million should come from. And if he wants us to go further and match the tax cut of Philip Hammond, he has to tell us where the £500 million is going to come from. But since he likes comparisons, let me give him a few. Murdo Fraser again yesterday was talking about public sector workers. So let me give him a few illustrations of the differences between Scotland and the rest of the UK. And these illustrations take account of the Scottish Government's tax plans and the Scottish Government's pay policy. So an NHS porter at the top of Agenda for Change Band 2 will be £800 better off in Scotland than if they worked in NHS England. A radiographer will be £380 better off in Scotland. A New Start police officer will be £4,500 better off in Scotland. A police constable at the top of their scale, they're going to be £1,200 better off in Scotland than in the rest of the UK. And lastly, in terms of the illustrations, let's take a paramedic working hard in our ambulance service, £400 better off in Scotland than if they worked in the rest of the UK. So I think this budget is a good deal. Of course, all of that doesn't even take account of the fact that if you live and work in Scotland, your children don't have to pay £9,000 a year to go to university. Your elderly relative doesn't have to pay for personal care. Taxpayers in Scotland, at whatever amount they earn, get a far better deal under this government, and long may it continue.
Jackson Carlaw.
It is so long ago that I asked my question, I might just remind the Chamber of what it was. I asked the First Minister in how many of the following years the Scottish Fiscal Commission predicted that economic growth would be greater in Scotland. The First Minister didn't answer that because the answer is none. In every year from 2019 until 2023, Scotland's growth rate is predicted by the Scottish Fiscal Commission to be lower than the UK as a whole. Scotland in the slow lane with the SNP. But, Presiding Officer, it's no surprise we don't get answers from this First Minister. She simply prefers to shout abuse from the sidelines, stoking up her indignation this week to berate the Prime Minister. This from the same First Minister, who for the last year and a half has dangled Scotland on a thread as she's danced and dodged around her deeply divisive second independence referendum. Double standards and hypocrisy, aren't they the hallmarks of this SNP government?
First Minister.
Jackson Carlaw, embarrassingly for him, talks about people shouting abuse. Tory MPs have spent the week shouting abuse at each other while they plunge this entire country into chaos and crisis. But let's go back to the GDP figures and the performance of Scotland's economy. The point I was making about Jackson Carlaw's questions about forecast GDP growth is if you wind the clock back, the figures wouldn't have predicted that our economy was growing faster than the UK's in this year. And yet our economy is growing faster than the UK's in this year. Scotland's GDP outperforming the UK in the first 6 months of this year. Scotland's unemployment rate at the lowest rate on record and lower than any of the other UK nations. Scotland's exports increasing faster than in any other UK nation, and of course we continue to be the best part of the UK outside of London when it comes to attracting foreign direct investment. So an economy that is doing better, a budget that is fairer and gives a better deal to people hard-working in our public sector and across our private sector. That's what you get when you get real, strong and stable government in Scotland with the SNP. And what a welcome contrast to the utter shambles that the Tories are presiding over at Westminster.
Thank you. First turn to question 2. Can you just say that was 12 and a half minutes for that opening exchange? That is too long. That is too long. And I would expect succinct questions, succinct answers from now on. Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Presiding officer, yesterday Derek Mackay said that the Scottish Government will continue to mitigate the worst impacts of the Tory Government's social security cuts. Is the two-child cap on tax credits and universal credit not one of the worst impacts?
First Minister.
Well, as Richard Leonard knows, this government does everything it can to mitigate UK welfare cuts. We are spending in the region of £100 million every year to do that. The fact that we cannot mitigate every cut is not a lack of political will. It's a fact of basic arithmetic. We don't hold the budget for reserved areas of welfare, so every penny of mitigation has to come from another area of our responsibilities. As the UN Special Rapporteur on Poverty said just a few weeks ago, and I'm quoting, devolved administrations have tried to mitigate the worst impacts of austerity, but mitigation comes at a price and is not sustainable. So I would say to Richard Leonard again, if he wants us not simply to mitigate UK government Tory welfare cuts, but to stop them at source, will he join with me today and ask for all of those powers over welfare to be devolved to this Parliament? That's the real answer. Why won't Richard Leonard back it?
Richard Leonard.
Presiding officer, here are the facts. This Parliament has the power to mitigate the two-child cap, and that would immediately benefit 3,780 families across Scotland, some by over £2,500 per child per year. The urgent issue for these families is not which Parliament sets social security policy, it's whether their kids go to bed hungry tonight and whether they can clothe them tomorrow morning. It would just cost 0.2% of the Scottish budget to deliver. So why won't you act?
First Minister.
I'm going to make a genuine offer to Richard Leonard right now, and I hope it's one that he takes seriously. Derek Mackay, when he set out the budget yesterday, fully allocated all of the resources that the Scottish Government has at our disposal. I know Labour thought we had kept £300 million in a reserve, but they misread the budget. We'd actually taken £300 million out of reserve to spend on public services. So we've used our tax powers and we've allocated all of the resources at our disposal. We've chosen to invest in the health service, in education, local government, in welfare. Now, my offer to Richard Leonard is, of course, there's many other things I would love to have the money to do. So if Richard Leonard wants us to spend money on other things, then he has to come to us. We'll help him cost these things, because we know from comments from his colleagues this week that they have difficulty in Labour costing their proposals. We'll help him cost them, but once they're costed, if he wants to have any credibility and to be taken seriously, he has to tell us where in the draft budget he wants that money to come from. Is it the health investment? Is it local government? Is it other areas of welfare? So that's an offer to Richard Leonard. If he tells us that, we will listen seriously. Let's see if Labour are prepared to step up to the plate.
Richard Leonard.
Well, Derek Mackay says yesterday the choice is either reducing public services or taxing more the lowest earners. What about taxing more the highest earners? Presiding officer, this comes down in the end to what this Parliament was created for in the first place. It should be a platform to lift people out of poverty. And there is a precedent for this. In 2014, this Parliament came together to mitigate the impact of the bedroom tax in Scotland. And the SNP said then that it couldn't be done. They said then that they didn't want to let Westminster off the hook. First Minister, this is about lifting children out of poverty, not letting the Tories off the hook. So why don't you do it?
First Minister.
Well, as we have just heard in the exchange I've just had with Jackson Carlaw, we are asking already higher rate taxpayers in Scotland to pay a bit more than they would if they lived elsewhere in the UK. That is fair and reasonable. Richard Leonard, well, I hear top earners. All of the assessment, all of the modelling suggests that because of behavioural changes, if we were to raise top rate, and we have raised the top rate, but if we were to do it more, then that could lose us revenue. And even if Richard Leonard, this is a serious budgetary point, even if Richard Leonard doesn't agree with that, even if I don't agree with that, if that's what the Scottish Fiscal Commission says, then we don't have that money to spend. You know, anybody who knows anything about budgeting must know that. Of course, as a source from Labour said this week, that they don't even have a plan. At least when we had a plan, ridiculous as it was, we had a plan. Now we have nothing, it's a shambles. That comes from Labour's own benches. But I will make the offer again. We've got some weeks now before Parliament has to decide on this budget. If Richard Leonard, and I would love to do this, what he's suggesting around the two-child cap, but we don't have the money. So if I am making a serious offer here, if Labour, Richard Leonard and his finance spokesperson come to me and Derek Mackay and say, we think you should take the money from this area of the budget or that area of the budget, I will listen. So the offer is there for Richard Leonard. We've allocated all the money in the budget. If he wants to spend more, well, he has to tell us how much his tax proposals will spend. We heard this week they don't have a tax plan in Labour. So the offer is there. I say again, let's see if Labour are going to step up to the plate over the next few weeks.
We've got a number of requests for supplementaries. The first from Willie Coffey, to be followed by Mike Rumbles.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've recently been contacted by my constituent Laura Nanny, an EU citizen who's lived in Scotland for over 30 years. Although Laura has lived in Scotland all of her working life, the Department for Work and Pensions has determined she has no right to reside in the UK. What can the First Minister and the Scottish Government do to help European Union citizens residing in Scotland who have wrongfully been denied universal credit through the habitual residency test?
First Minister.
Well, this is a shameful circumstance. The right to reside test is applied to low-income benefits reserved to the UK Government. It is a complex barrier for EU nationals that the UK deems, quote, economically inactive. The European Commission has described this test as, and I'm quoting, direct discrimination based on nationality. I can advise the Chamber that we are taking a more humane approach for our new Best Start grant because the Scottish system is defined by dignity, fairness and respect. We value EU nationals and we will not subject them to needless stress, anxiety and financial hardship. EU nationals in Laura's position, of course, may also be eligible for the Scottish Welfare Fund. The UK system increasingly is known for two things: inhumanity and incorrect decisions. So I would advise Laura to seek independent advice on whether there might be a case for appeal, and I would encourage members across the chamber to continue to press the UK Government to scrap universal credit and to start having a welfare policy overall that's based on dignity, respect and above all else humanity, because the current system is definitely not.
Mike Rumbles, to be followed by Bob Doris.
With a written answer published yesterday, the Government has made no mention of any new vessels for the Gourock to Dunoon ferry service, or indeed has any attempt been made to give any assurance to long-suffering passengers that they might actually have any prospect of receiving an adequate service, as they've had to put up with a record level of cancellations and repeated delays on this route. First Minister, when is the Scottish Government going to provide a decent service on this route?
First Minister.
Well, the Scottish Government is committed to providing not just decent but good services on all of our ferry routes, including Dunoon-Gourock. In my previous ministerial roles, the Dunoon-Gourock ferry service was something I was very closely involved in. I will ask the Transport Minister to write to the member specifically on the current situation, and I'm sure he'd be happy to meet with him and constituents to discuss any concerns that they have fully.
Bob Doris, to be followed by Liam Kerr.
First Minister, news broke yesterday that Gemini Rail Services plan to close its Springburn site with the loss of up to 200 jobs in my constituency. A devastating blow for the workforce, our communities and our proud locomotive industry, with the St Rollock site itself dating back to 1856. I've spoken to Unite and to the company who leased the site to Gemini Rail. Whilst there is anger and concern, there is also a determination, First Minister, to save jobs and continue to see a future for the site. Will the First Minister commit to bringing together all relevant parties, including Gemini Rail, trade unions and Scottish enterprise, to do all we can to secure the future of as many jobs as possible at this historic site? And the Scottish Government has shown a strong willingness to act in such circumstances previously. Will it act now, not just for the workers themselves and for my constituents, but also for the strategic interests of the Scottish economy?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Bob Doris for raising this issue, and yes, I will ask the Transport Minister to bring all interested parties together in the way that he describes. The Scottish Government learned of this development only through the media, and let me say I am extremely disappointed that that is the case. Officials met with the new owners last week, but no reference was made on any immediate plans to make such an announcement. The Scottish Government, of course, will continue to engage constructively with the owners in the interests of the staff affected and the overall Scottish economy, and we are committed to supporting rail services and, of course, have made record investment in rail in recent years. The market for refurbishment of older rolling stock is challenging, but there does remain opportunities to bid for future work. So I will ask the Transport Secretary to convene interested parties and, of course, ask Bob Doris to be part of these discussions.
Liam Kerr, to be followed by Andy Whiteman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It has emerged the £218 million from the Aberdeen City Region deal to slash train times to the Central Belt by 20 minutes will only deliver 2 minutes. Certainly, it won't track the Usan Junction, which was first promised by the SNP to the North East in 2008 and reheated in 2016. So what reassurances can the First Minister give that the 20-minute claims were sufficiently evidenced in advance and that the City Region deal funding will generate real improvements for rail customers in Aberdeen?
First Minister.
Well, again, at risk of keeping him very busy, I'll ask the Transport Minister to write in terms of the specifics of the evidence behind the 20-minute issue. In terms of the question overall, we are absolutely committed to ensuring continuing improvement for rail passengers in every part of the country, and as Derek Mackay made clear in the budget yesterday, we are also committed to city region deals, not just the existing city region deals, but seeing such deals rolled out across other parts of the country, because they do offer huge potential for improvements, not just in transport, but in other areas of the economy as well.
Andy Whiteman, to be followed by Christine Graham.
Yesterday's budget states that investment in social care and integration will increase to over £700 million next year. However, last Thursday, the Polmont Community Health Project in North Edinburgh was told its funding would be cut when the Edinburgh IGB meets tomorrow. This is Scotland's oldest community health project, where folk have worked tirelessly to tackle social isolation and reduce health inequalities in one of the country's most deprived areas. With 40 staff at risk of losing their job, can I ask the First Minister what support the Scottish Government can provide in light of yesterday's budget to ensure that this funding decision is reconsidered?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Andy Whitman for raising this issue. These are, of course, local decisions. This is a local decision, although I understand the concern that has been expressed about Pilton Community Health Project. As I understand it, the Edinburgh Integration Joint Board will consider the recommendations from their Health and Social Care Grants Programme Steering Group on the 14th of this month and make a decision on future funding for all of the projects who applied. In these circumstances, I hope Andy Whitman would accept that it would not be appropriate for me to comment on an individual application until this meeting has taken place. But I will ask the Health Secretary to update him once things have progressed further.
Christine Graham, to be followed by Gail Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware of the tragic death of my constituent Amanda Cox, who, having given birth to a premature son after visiting him in the special baby unit at the Royal Edinburgh Infirmary on Monday, became disorientated. Missing for 7 hours, it was not until after 10 p.m. she was found in a disused part of the hospital, seriously ill. She died shortly after. It's a dreadful tragedy for the family, and there's a small child now without a mother. There is an internal inquiry and the PF has issued a report. However, just this morning I've heard from Michael, her husband, that the hospital administration has requested a meeting with him to discuss a review of processes. This man is grieving and traumatised, and to me this is highly inappropriate and looks like face-saving. Can I therefore ask the First Minister if the Cabinet Secretary for Health will keep a very close watching brief on this matter and in the meantime confirm to the Chamber that none of our hospitals have processes which would let people down in such a tragic manner?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I say that my thoughts and sympathies are very much with Amanda Cox's family at this extremely sad time for them. This is an absolutely tragic situation, and of course our thoughts are with all of her family, but in particular with her husband and her little boy, who of course remains in hospital. NHS Lothian are assisting the police with their investigation into the circumstances of this tragic case. In addition to the police investigation, though, the board does want to urgently review the care that Amanda received to ensure that all appropriate lessons are learned, and I know that they are in close contact with Amanda's family to ensure that they are kept informed while the review is carried out. But Christine Graham is absolutely right to say that that must be done appropriately and sensitively, given the fact that Amanda's husband in particular is deeply grieving at this time, and I will communicate the concerns that Christine Graham has raised back to NHS Lothian, who are also, as I'm sure everybody would understand, very distressed by the tragic circumstances that have unfolded. The Health Secretary, of course, will keep a very close watch on developments here, and I'm sure would be happy to discuss the matter with Christine Graham as more information and facts and understanding of what happened here comes to light. But in the meantime, I'm sure all of us right across the chamber will want Amanda's family to know that our thoughts are with them at this impossibly difficult time.
And Gail Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister is aware that last week we received the news that yet another business in Ross-shire, Carbon Dynamic, has sadly gone into administration. Can the First Minister outline what help and support the Scottish Government can give the 40 staff that have been made redundant, and any help to find a buyer for the business, which still has a healthy order sheet?
First Minister.
Well, thank you to Gail Ross for raising this situation. I am aware of the position at Carbon Dynamic. CLDB Limited is the overall name of the company, and I know that this will be an extremely anxious time for the staff working at the company, their families and the whole community. Obviously, the individuals affected by the announcement are our immediate priority, and we recognise the important role they play in the economy, so we will do everything within our power to help those affected. The PACE team has already been in contact with KPMG to offer support to affected employees. KPMG issued redundancy guides and information of support to all employees on Friday of last week, and they will continue to provide skills development and employability support. The Economy Secretary will be very happy to talk to and meet with Gail Ross to see if there is further assistance that the Scottish Government can bring to bear.
Question number 3, Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. Yesterday, the Scottish Government's Finance Secretary claimed that he was providing a real terms increase of more than £200 million to local services around the country, such as that mentioned by my colleague Andy Whiteman. But once again, this claim ignores the fact that the Scottish Government is forcing councils to use their resources to fund Scottish Government policies. Within hours of the budget being published, COSLA shared their analysis, showing that the reality was more than a £175 million cut, which they then revised a few hours later again when they'd seen through some of the Scottish Government's sleight of hand. They're saying a £200 million cut. And then later, Parliament's independent research unit, whose impartial work sometimes shows the truth being somewhere between what the Scottish Government and local government say, they produced more detailed work saying the truth is more than a £300 million cut to local services. Councils around the country are now being forced to look at cuts to schools, social care, parks, libraries. Where does the First Minister think those cuts should fall?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Patrick Harvie for raising the issue. The settlement, of course, that was outlined by Derek Mackay yesterday does deliver a real terms increase in both revenue and in capital funding to local councils. Of course, that is before we take account of councils' own ability to raise revenue through the council tax. Yes, that does include funding that the Scottish Government has made available to increase childcare, £210 million in revenue for childcare. It, yes, includes a transfer from health to help fund social care. These are all important priorities, and it's absolutely right that the Scottish Government and local councils work together to ensure the delivery of these priorities. But I'm going to make the same offer to Patrick Harvie as I made to Richard Leonard. On past form, Patrick Harvie will be more likely to step up to the plate on this than Richard Leonard is likely to be. But we have allocated all of the resources at our disposal in this budget. I would like to do more for local government, for health, in a whole range of different areas. But if opposition parties want extra spending in some areas of the budget, then there is a duty to say what areas of the budget they think that money should come from. We are happy to have those constructive discussions. As I say, I think we're probably more likely to have them with Patrick Harvie and his colleagues than with other parties in the chamber. But they have to be hard-headed discussions because we can't create money out of nowhere. So I look forward to having these discussions in the weeks to come.
Patrick Harvie.
I haven't for a moment suggested that the new national policies are bad policies or inappropriate. They are important. But if they're national policies, they should be funded from national resources, not from a raid on council budgets. Nor was there a word yesterday in the statement about fairer local taxation. Nothing about genuine steps toward a replacement for the broken, unfair council tax, which the Scottish Government claims that it wants to end, and nothing about new ideas to help councils raise money in new ways to fund the services that are needed. The Scottish Government does keep saying that they're open to dialogue on these issues, but we've been trying to have that dialogue on the basis of detailed proposals since the end of the last budget process at the start of this year. The question is not who's going to step up and have dialogue. The question is, when are we going to hear some kind of response from the Scottish Government? When will they show any hint of urgency and leadership, even in making their own policy on council tax a reality?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, let me answer this question in two parts. In terms of the spending decisions we've made in the budget, in terms of national priorities, we have given extra money to local government to meet the costs of these priorities. And on spending, and this is simply a statement of fact, if any opposition party wants us to spend more in a particular area, they have to also tell us where they think we should spend less. That's a simple statement of arithmetic. On the issue of local tax reform, yesterday we set out our tax and spending decisions. That's the appropriate thing to do when we publish the draft budget. There have already been discussions, I know, between Patrick Harvie and his colleagues and the Finance Secretary about tax reform. Derek Mackay is keeping me updated on those. We would expect those discussions to continue, and I very much hope that we can come to an agreement around that does see a commitment to local tax reform and a greater commitment to devolution of tax power to local authorities. There is a willingness to do that, and in the normal way, between now and the final votes in this budget, I'm sure we'll have lots of very productive, or at least I hope they will be productive discussions.
I think a couple of further supplementaries. The first from Neil Findlay.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish charity regulator Oscar states an organisation cannot continue to be a charity if it is set up to be or advance a political party, or its governing document allows it to use its assets for non-charitable purposes. Does the First Minister believe the Institute of Statecraft, based in Fife, should continue to be registered as a charity excuse me, with Oscar, given the revelations this week that it has been engaged in partisan political activity?
First Minister.
Well, I was concerned about the revelations that were published in the Sunday Mail on Sunday. Clearly, those revelations involved alleged actions of the Foreign Office, and therefore it's not for me to investigate the veracity or otherwise, but certainly on the face of it, it was a concerning report. And I hope we do see full investigation and full answers to questions that people will rightly and understandably have. On the question about the Oscar and whether or not an organisation is a charity, I absolutely understand the sentiment behind Neil Findlay's question and why he's asking me that, but I know he will also appreciate that Oscar takes these decisions independently, and it's right that it does so, and I'm sure Oscar keeps the charitable status of a whole range of organisations under review if concerns are raised about them, and I would encourage him, if he does, as he clearly and understandably does have concerns about this, perhaps to raise those concerns directly with Oscar.
And Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Road traffic accidents in Scotland have increased by 7%, as reported this morning in The Lancet, since the introduction of the Scottish Government's lower alcohol level limits for drivers in 2014. First Minister, is this a direct result of yet another failed SNP government policy?
First Minister.
So, well,
during the festive season, that's irresponsible.
But just let me, as I recall, when this Parliament decided to lower the drink driving limit, it did so unanimously, which obviously must mean that the Conservatives supported that. And credit to the Conservatives for supporting that, because I don't think it can reasonably be said that road traffic accidents are increasing because we've cut the drink driving limit. That makes no sense. But can I say, in all seriousness, right now, we are in the festive season. At this time of year, we should do this at every time of year, but particularly at this time of year, the message that should come unanimously from all of us to everybody across Scotland is do not drink and drive. And I find it deeply regrettable that today, as we go into the Christmas period, we have a Conservative MSP standing up, somehow seeming to suggest that lowering the drink driving limit was a bad thing to do. I hope he will reflect very seriously on the question he's just asked.
Question number 4, Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what progress the Scottish Government is making in delivering the Best Start grant.
First Minister.
Well, I'm pleased to say that we are now delivering the Best Start grant, pregnancy and baby payment. By the end of the first day on Monday, more than 4,000 claims had been submitted, which is an exceptional response and an important moment for Social Security Scotland. The payment will provide £600 on the birth of a first child, which is £100 more than the UK system it is replacing. The first payments will be made before Christmas, as promised, and will begin to reach bank accounts next week. We've also extended eligibility and the application window, and unlike the current DWP system, we will not put a cap on children. So we have introduced our £300 payment for second and subsequent children. As a very significant number of claims submitted in the first days shows, our work to encourage take-up of this benefit for low-income families is paying off, and I am delighted that we are using our new social security powers to provide improved financial support for all of the children of low-income families.
Claire Adamson.
First Minister, I am delighted to hear that so many people have applied for the new Scottish Government benefit. It will greatly help many of my constituents in Motherwell and Wishaw. Does the First Minister agree that this grant is another example clearly demonstrating that this SNP Government believes social security is there as a safety net, supporting people on low incomes and encouraging benefit take-up, in sharp contrast to the shameful othering of benefits, those in benefits perpetrated by the Conservative Government?
First Minister.
Yes, I agree with that. I think the fantastic response to the Best Start grant is a clear sign that people know that Scottish social security will be different from the current UK system. We see social security as an investment in our people. We're doing all we can to make sure that people get the financial support they're entitled to, which of course includes encouraging them to apply for this new benefit. Our communication alongside that of stakeholders is focused on new parents and importantly families who would not have received a UK Sure Start maternity grant for the child because they were not the first born. These are families who know that they can be supported by our Best Start grant, and so we expect a significant proportion of applications will be for second children. And that is important because this government is determined to give all children the very best start in life.
Question number 5, Annie Wells.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to a recent survey which suggests that 51% of teachers believe that their job has a detrimental impact on their mental health.
First Minister.
Well, we recognise the pressures and challenges facing teachers, such as those highlighted by the Mental Health Foundation Scotland. That's why we've taken action to reduce teacher workloads, clarify and simplify the curriculum framework and remove unnecessary bureaucracy. We also continue to take forward a range of actions to support the mental health of both teachers and children and young people. These include delivering specific resources for mental health education to teachers across Scotland and providing mental health first aid training for schools.
Annie Wells.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. From the survey carried out by the Mental Health Foundation, it's clear that teachers are under immense pressure, with more than 7 out of 10 saying they lack the skills to support pupils with mental health problems. And on top of this, total teacher numbers are down by more than 3,000 since the SNP came to power, heaping additional workload and pressures with serious implications for their well-being. And I welcome the commitment to see counsellors and mental health nurses in school. However, when will we see a delivery plan for counselling and mental health training in schools, as I have repeatedly called for, and what action will be taken to drastically improve current vacancy numbers?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, in terms of teacher numbers, of course, we had the recent statistics about teacher numbers published on Tuesday of this week. They showed that teacher numbers this year were up 447 on the previous year. There are now more teachers working in our schools than at any time since 2010, and primary teacher numbers are now at their highest level since 1980. That's when I was still at primary school. So teacher numbers are rising. Since I became First Minister, teacher numbers have increased by more than 1,200 in Scotland. Of course, teachers still work under significant pressure. And one of those pressures, of course, is dealing with young people with mental health issues. That's why we have announced the plans to put more counsellors into schools and also to improve training for teachers. All of us need to become more mental health aware. The Mental Health Minister will set out the further details of that, including the timeline in due course and indeed soon. And I hope these are measures that all of Parliament will get behind.
Question number 6, Jackie Bailey.
To ask the First Minister how many people will be taken out of fuel poverty in 2018-19.
First Minister.
Well, the national measurement of fuel poverty is based on the annual Scottish House Conditions Survey, so the 2018 rate will not be published until December 2019. The most up-to-date statistics we have for 2017 show that since 2013, fuel poverty has reduced by 11 percentage points from 36% to 25%, which is a reduction of almost 250,000 households. However, despite fuel poverty levels now being at their lowest since 2005, it is unacceptable that around 25% of households are still in fuel poverty, which is why we're taking action on energy efficiency and fuel poverty. By the end of 2021, we will have committed more than £1 billion since 2009, making homes warmer and fuel bills lower, and over 120,000 homes have benefited through our home energy efficiency programmes since 2013.
Jackie Bailey.
There are more than 1 in 4 people in Scotland living in fuel poverty, and for an energy-rich country, that is a national scandal. In that context, the First Minister's target of ending fuel poverty by 2040 is deeply unambitious. More than a decade ago, Energy Action Scotland told the Scottish Government that it needed to spend £200 million a year if it was serious about wanting to end fuel poverty. Yet the latest budget only provides about half that amount, and 30 million of that is financial transaction funding, which requires to be repaid. As we face the prospect of a very cold winter, will the First Minister adopt a greater degree of urgency, bring forward the date by which fuel poverty will end in Scotland, and stop the scandal of older people having to choose between eating and heating?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, there is urgency on the part of the Scottish Government. I repeat again, we've seen a number of households, almost 250,000 households moved out of fuel poverty, and the rate reduced between 2014 and 2017, which is not enough. I don't want to live in a country where 25% of households live in fuel poverty. That's why we have set ambitious but what we consider to be deliverable targets, as well as the 2040 targets. Our route map outlines minimum standards for the private rented sector from April 2020, which will be the first time the private rented sector has been regulated, and next year we'll introduce regulations for all PRS properties to reach energy efficient band D by April 2025, and we've consulted on increasing that standard to require band C by 2030, and we'll confirm next steps on that measure next year. So we are determined to take the action necessary. Lastly, Presiding Officer, on the funding point, I will make the same point that I have made repeatedly already today. If any member of this Parliament, as we move into the next stages of this budget, wants us to spend more on particular areas, we will listen. We will be constructive and we will listen to all ideas, but they must come with also the suggestions of where in our fully allocated draft budget that money comes from, and I look forward to hearing these proposals in due course.
Thank you very much. That concludes First Minister's questions. Can I just say before members go, I made an appeal last week for members for short questions, succinct answers. I appeal again this week. I have to say I don't think members are listening. I've spoken to business managers, I've written to ministers, I've written to members. Can I please ask you, I'm not going to become overly interventionist overnight, but unless these questions and answers are short and succinct, I will cut members off. And make sure we get through more members, more questions. So please listen to my advice. Thank you. Now we're going
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK Government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.